Hello and happy Friday, and thanks for tuning in to RadioFreeRhinecliff.org. And this show in particular, correct me if I'm Norman, I'm your host, Norman. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Mr. Fenton Johnson. Fenton, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Fenton Johnson, born May 7th, 1888, is an American poet, essayist, author of short stories, and an educator. He came from a middle-class African-American family in Chicago, where he spent most of his career. His work has often included anthologies of 20th century poetry. He's noted for early prose poetry, and he's been called, quote, one of the first Negro revolutionary poets, and is also considered forerunner of the Harlem Renaissance. Fenton, thanks for being here tonight.
That's correct.
Now that's, I got a smile out of you. That's the other Fenton Johnson.
That is the other Fenton Johnson.
A man of letters and would be a lot older than you.
I learned about Fenton Johnson, the African-American poet, long ago in Kentucky when in high school, Life magazine did a series on forgotten African Americans, and they had a full page devoted to Fenton Johnson, and my classmates brought it in LaRue County, Kentucky, and made really terrible racist jokes about my heritage.
Right.
But I was glad to find out about Fenton Johnson. In fact, I know a lot about Fenton Johnson.
I had a hunch you would.
In my head, there is an essay to be written called Fenton Johnson on Fenton Johnson by Fenton Johnson.
Well, and what form is that taking in your head? I mean, is it just a glib idea, or you started to flesh it out?
I've started to flesh it out. I called, his papers are at the the huge archive that's the University of Texas, the biggest archive anywhere. He has a handwritten novel which has never been published.
Wow.
He was a formative figure because he was not. It's impossible to say who was the first, but he was certainly among the first to recognize that African American vernacular, especially hymns, were poetry and could be made into poetry.
Right.
So in his books of poetry, he has the sort of very classical Victorian the sun that brief December day rose cheerless over here, hills of gray. I mean, that kind of poetry. But he also has poetry drawn from Black spirituals, and that was pretty radical at the time.
Interesting. Certainly some of the people writing these hymns felt that they were writing poetry.
Yes, but the question was and is, and I'm sorry to say may ever and always be, white people's blindness, because they couldn't hear that. Stephen Foster, though he's come in for a lot of manure in the past several years, nonetheless, he was the first white person to listen to African Americans singing, to listen to slaves singing, and to say, this can be made into music. And he wrote, his music is based in African American slave songs. So do we diss him because he did that, or do we celebrate him because at least he had that level of perception and he brought it to white people's consciousness?
I imagine that depends largely on which way the academic winds are blowing at any particular moment.
It does. But, when you think about it, Stephen Foster putting Black music on the stage is arguably the most significant musical gesture of the last 500 years, if not longer. Think about it. I mean, somebody was going to do it, but Stephen Foster did it. And when you think about the role of Black music worldwide, and also what that meant in terms of our capacity to hear other people's music, to hear Latino music, and to hear West African music, and to hear Balkan music, it was really an extraordinary gesture. And of course, he died, he drowned in a face-down alcoholic in a gutter in Baltimore, which is what we do to our artists.
Gads. Now, you mentioned you grew up in Kentucky, and you grew up in the hill country of Kentucky. Was it mixed where you went to high school there? Was it all white? Was it all black in your family, or was it pretty well mixed?
It wasn't well mixed. Kentucky, like much, I mean, I know now, this has been what I've been researching for the past year. Kentucky had 40%. My home county, Nelson County, which is where bourbon is made, the bourbon capital of the world.
All right, let's take a time out right here because you brought drinks and I'm waiting to toast, and thank you for bringing them. You were going to bring mint juleps, which is, I guess, a Kentucky drink, and also traditionally drank for the Kentucky Derby, which is tomorrow. But you couldn't find good mint, right? So you brought,
correct.
What did you bring?
Manhattans.
A Manhattan, a perfect Manhattan?
Perfect Manhattan.
And what's the difference between perfect and regular?
A perfect Manhattan is made with half dry vermouth and half sweet vermouth, so that it is not quite as sweet as just a Manhattan.
Right.
So,
well, this is delicious. Cheers. Thank you, Fenton Johnson.
Well, thanks for having me here. Next time, mint juleps.
Good. So
next year in Jerusalem, and mint juleps.
So you were saying, growing up in Kentucky, it was not completely segregated.
Well, we think, what can I say? I mean, I think I can speak for everybody here when I say this. One shouldn't speak for other people, but white people, even woke white people, think we know about the history of slavery and racism in this country. And then you start doing a deep dive and you realize that we don't know anything at all. I don't know how, my home county was 40% black in 1860. It is now 7.5% black. Those people left because they were effectively driven out. And that's true throughout the South. But before the Northerners start feeling virtuous about accepting the black people, it's important to remember that in 1876, the North essentially sold all the black people to the South in the corrupt election and said to the Southerners, you give us the presidency and we'll let you do whatever you want with black people.
Egans.
And that led to Jim Crow and lynchings and that, that's the history of this country, which, as we know, is still sometimes, I don't know. I like to believe in, I want to believe in the Western myth of progress, that we're moving somewhere. But mostly I believe in, I take inspiration from the black people whose lives I've studied. James Baldwin is my personal hero, has been for my whole life. Frederick Douglass, I always quote Frederick Douglass because he must have thought at the time of the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that the battle was over, victory was won, and 40 years later, in his last speech ever, he said, I think things are darker than they ever were for African Americans in this country. But he still fought the battle. He still continued fighting, and I think that's where I try to take my inspiration.
Right. And you said you're researching. Is this the kind of stuff you're researching, and is that for your next book?
I mean, one is hesitant to, one has to sacrifice daily to the goddess of books in prayer and supplication and, firstborn child. So I want it to turn, I think it will turn into a book, but the story in brief is that I discovered that my great-grandfather was a Union soldier. This we know. He was wounded at the Battle of Stones River in 1863, joined right when the war started. That means that my father was held in the lap of a Civil War veteran, which is pretty unusual. I'm not exactly the oldest Union widow telling all, but I'm fairly close to it. There's not many people left alive who have such a direct connection to the Civil War. On my mother's side, my uncle 4 generations removed, in a drunken moment in 1823, left all of his considerable estate to a enslaved woman who was 16 years old and probably his daughter. And that led to a series of court cases. She may well be the first enslaved person south of the Ohio to successfully sue her owners.
And live to tell the
She
tale?
did not live.
Oh.
That was she.
Oof.
She died at 30 years old, but she did not before managing to wrest her freedom and the freedom of her sons many years later out of the estate.
So she lived through the court case.
She lived to file the court cases.
Okay.
And an illiterate woman, she nonetheless had the wherewithal, who is, of course, constantly called in all of the depositions dim and dull and, whatever. She had the wherewithal to hire the best lawyer in town, and he pursued the case less, I don't think, out of a sense of social justice. I think because there was a large estate awaiting on the other side of it, and he had, his percentage was to be 50%, which ultimately he received.
Right.
Anyway, that's what I've been looking into, and one thing leads to another, and that has led to a deep dive into the history of slavery in this country, and particularly in Kentucky, and particularly in the county where I grew up.
So where are you going to find alternate histories, or the more real histories? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff out there that's easy to find. It's not necessarily the true story.
Well, I make a distinction between fact and truth. The next novel that I write, and maybe even this book, is probably going to have as the first sentence or very close to the front, that most of what is here is factual and all of it is true, as best I can.
Nice. I like that.
Determine, fact is, it was a fact. In 1850, it was a fact that women were inherently inferior to men. It was a fact that Black people were inferior to white people. It is a truth that one should do unto others as they do unto you. So I would say to my students, fact is malleable, truth endures. And they would say, no, it's the other way around. And I say, think about it. So anyway, I because there is no coincidence and all moments are present to this moment, in one of the ways that the world works, I started into doing all this research, and it's too long of a story to tell, but ultimately, I mean, this is the county courthouse where I grew up. This is when I walked down to the street. I left when I was 17 years old to go to college. I walk down the street, people stop me and they say, your father was a Johnson, but who was your mother? I don't find your mother in your face. And I say, well, she was a Hubbard from Hodgenville. Oh, Hodgenville. Oh, which is like 15 miles away, which explains everything. And plus it's Protestant and whatever, so it's a place that is that intimate in terms of its knowledge, and therefore that silent about its past through a complicated series of events explained by the fact that there is no coincidence in the world. Because of me trying to get access to the county courthouse basement records, ultimately what ended up happening is that my sister was appointed to the person in charge of the records. So now I have
that's good luck.
Inside to the records. And Nelson County, because it's one of the 4 oldest counties west of the Appalachians and has never had a courthouse fire and has never had, the courthouse is still there. It has the most intact records. The records go back to around 1785. And I decided, at least for the moment, to do this as a nonfiction project rather than a fiction project because, I'm sure you have no difficulty believing this, but for me, the experience of holding Narcissa's, her name was Narcissa, holding her manumission papers and seeing her X on the bottom of the papers is just profoundly moving. And I don't want to fictionalize it because this was a real woman who really got herself to this place where she put her mark on those papers. And I feel like I want the authority of fact, that this really happened. And I hope to reproduce some of the papers, to reproduce in the book. Some of the manumission papers, some of the depositions. And that's the reason why virtually nobody from the first half of the 19th century has a paper trail. But here we have an enslaved, illiterate African-American woman who has an extensive paper trail because of, here's your situation. Imagine this. My uncle dies. She has no connections. She is the only person in this 1823 frontier town between the white men of the town and one of the larger fortunes amassed west of the Appalachians. The only barrier between the white men, some of the white men who go after it, and this fortune is an enslaved, illiterate, 16-year-old black woman, which is a pretty amazing.
She filed a suit. I mean, the stories are legion of enslaved people at that time trying to step into what they're owed and what they deserve, and they just get killed. They get lynched. I mean,
she died at 30 years old, and I'm trying to figure out why.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't. I have not written off the possibility that she was killed.
Right.
I don't think so for various reasons. I have various medical records that seem to indicate otherwise, but I don't know that, and I probably will never know that.
Do you know where she's buried?
I don't know, because she was, even though she was by that point free, she had no money. If she had a marker, it would have been a wooden cross,
right,
or a wooden plank. I'm going to go back and do some more research, but what we tend to forget in this country is that, especially west of the Appalachians, how really wild it was still.
Yeah.
We had driven out the native tribes, and so the landscape was largely empty, but it was still very wild.
It was the Wild West.
Yeah, the Wild West.
And the lawlessness pervaded
with
everything.
Extraordinary rapidity. Kentucky was the first California. It was the place that you went to when you wanted to flee the civilized, settled East Coast. So it was a particularly and that heritage is still very much alive for better and for worse, in the characters, in my character.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, now, I love what you said. You wanted to not write a fictional account because you really wanted to honor the trueness of her story and the facts of it.
Yeah.
And does that mean that it'll be 100% true, or will there be sections where it's like, oh, this section is historical fiction, connecting the dots?
I have to figure that out, and then, then you enter into the world of writing a book, which is I say. I start out imagining the Taj Mahal, and then it becomes a 40-room Georgian mansion by the sea, and then it becomes a split-level Frank Lloyd Wright, house in Oak Park.
Nice.
And then it becomes a two-bedroom cottage
on South Street.
On South Street, and finally I have a shack with indoor plumbing. But I say to my students, if I didn't start with the Taj Mahal, I wouldn't have indoor plumbing. So right. I feel like it's important to start with the Taj Mahal. And right now, it's the Taj Mahal. It can be anything it wants to be.
So in your process, when you get it down to the 2-bedroom shack on South Street with indoor plumbing, do you often find yourself getting it back up to the Frank Lloyd Wright, 4-bedroom house, or does it sort of stay there? And
well, I think I can. Here I am speak for other people again, but I think the reason to undertake any kind of creative endeavor, whether it's gardening or raising a child or writing a book or making a painting or whatever, I look back at my books and honestly, I read into them and I think, who wrote that? I'm not nearly smart enough to write that book. I don't know that, and yet evidently I did. There it is. It's got my name on it. And I don't know, some through some, Freud or Jung had some language for this, but, some sort of demon, that was the word, it's spelled Daemon, daemon, I guess.
Right.
Comes in and starts speaking and
The muse.
and is smarter than I am,
Right.
And so in that sense, maybe my books are, of course I have my favorites, but one is never supposed to have favorites among one's children. But
almost everyone does.
I asked an author once that question on a plane, and she said, of course, my last one is my favorite. It has to be.
Right.
I'm not sure I would say that, but I mean, I like all of them in their different ways. They're, they reflect different moments in my life.
And you've written quite a few of them over the years, haven't you? Both fiction and
7
nonfiction.
at this point, and this would be, notice the conditional tense, the 8th.
Would be, not is going to be.
Well, on verra, as they say in France. When I write the end, then I will have, I don't know.
And do you write on a computer?
I used to write everything longhand. I love the feeling of the connection between the brain. There's no break between the brain and the pen and the page when I'm writing longhand.
Script or printed?
Script.
All right.
I used to, in fact, for a long period of my life, I was entirely instinctive. If I went to the computer, I knew that what I was writing wasn't really that important. And if I picked up a pen, it was something important.
Well, that's kind of beautiful.
But I've kind of gotten away from that as I've gotten some arthritis in my hands. And but I also have to write on the back of used paper. I cannot write on, Baudelaire said, the paper protects itself in its whiteness. And that's the way I feel about it. So I will travel with used computer paper, pages I printed out so that I have,
because it gives it a sense or first proofs, or
it gives it a sense of being really a draft. Like,
right.
I'm just playing around here. This isn't really serious. And that kind of liberates me. Whereas if I just have plain paper,
right.
It feels like, it's got to be perfect the first time around.
Which
is the part of the problem with doing things on a laptop is what comes out of it, what the printer produces is so typeset that it kind of resists being modified. Whereas handwriting is obviously rough draft. And
so now is it a little bit of both?
I kind of go back and forth. Yeah. I go back and forth, but I take absurdly detailed. I'd never read W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, or its very important appendage essay, Souls of White Folk. And I could take those notes in a laptop, but I laboriously handwrite every one of them, because when I handwrite them, I've found that somewhere they register in my DNA, and 3 or 4 years later, I can think, I remember somebody saying that, and I can call it forth if I handwrote it.
Right.
Whereas if I just typed it in, I often can't remember that. Now, on the other hand, if I want to see, what does Suzuki Roshi have to say about anger? Then I have all my notes, my, 600 single space pages of notes, and I can type in the word anger and just find every instance of the word. And that is, so it's really great to be able to do both of them. I feel for people who don't have handwriting, I would absolutely teach my child handwriting. I just think it's a marvelous skill to have. Why would you want to deny somebody that skill?
And I think they're not teaching script anymore in schools.
A lot of places they're not. And
strange.
In fact, here's I went to the Harriet Beecher Stowe, a museum over in Hartford, and I was on a tour with 7 other people. And the docent was like, she'd just been hired. She was like the assistant director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Museum. And they won't let you touch everything because unlike a lot of museums, everything there is original. It's her furnishings, her everything. But we get into the dining room and she said, here we've reproduced certain of her letters and you can pick them up and read them if you want. I can't read them because I can't read cursive handwriting. And I said, what? And she said, do you read cursive handwriting? I said, yeah. And she said, would you read a letter for us? And I didn't want to so I turned to the other people in the group and I said, who were mostly younger people, 30s, early 40s. One of them was another woman who had just been hired. I said, does anybody read cursive writing? I was the only person who could read cursive handwriting. And I could not be doing what I'm doing in the Nelson County Library. Every document, of course, in the Nelson County Library is in cursive handwriting.
And many by people, I'm sure, who took a lot of pride in their beautiful penmanship.
You really learn to appreciate the ones who write well, because a lot of them don't.
Right.
And you're, what is this word? Scratched out and, whatever.
So you learned that, I'm guessing, from a young age at school down there in Kentucky.
I learned
And
right.
what kind of school did you go to?
Oh, my God. I went to St. Catherine Grade School. The Scottish Catholics fleeing Scotland after the defeat of Scotland, of the Scottish Catholics by the English Protestants, ultimately ended up in this rural Kentucky. So there are these 3 counties that are almost 100% Catholic in the middle of rural Kentucky. Very improbable. The first 4 Catholic archdioceses in the United States were Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Bardstown, Kentucky, which is the county seat it's where I'm doing all my research.
Right.
And so it was very Catholic. And at this point in the 60s, the Catholic educational system was falling apart. The nuns were all leaving. They pulled these aged sisters out of the convent who had been retired for years and said, you got to teach these kids, because they weren't going to fork out to hire qualified teachers. So we had teachers who were, who didn't, in 2 of my grade school classes, I was told that we were not going to study math or science because these were godless subjects. And I resented that for ages. And then in the course of writing a book, I thought about that woman and I thought, she didn't know how to teach math or science.
Right.
She did this because she had been put in a position that she didn't know how to do, and she had no support, and it was an excuse not to embarrass herself in front of 7th graders to say, this is why I'm not teaching you. So on the other hand, if you ask me the 7 gifts of the Holy Ghost, I can name those right off the top of my head, and it's pretty useful actually to know. So some of those concepts are the difference between, this is what we did in the 7th grade. So this is why I got into so much trouble. I said to the teacher.
Go on.
So I know you're not supposed to commit a mortal sin. And if you commit a single mortal sin, you're going to go to hell for eternity. But if you commit a single mortal sin and you're going to go to hell for eternity, then why not commit a lot more mortal sins? And she said, the devil made you ask that question. But that's the question that's behind Dante's Inferno. He's trying to figure out a system of justice that differentiates between the people who commit what he considers to be relatively minor mortal sins and the people who are. So here I'll ask you a question. This is a fun cocktail. Who are the 3 people today who you would put in the 9th of the 9th circles at the bottom of hell? Who would be the 3 people whom you would put?
There's a show on this network that specializes in political conversation. But yeah, they'd all be politicians, I'm sure. You'd probably be able to guess them. But
yeah, maybe. I mean, it's an interesting question because, of course, Dante thought about this question.
Yeah.
He thought very long and hard about who those 3 people were going. You only got 3, so who are they going to be?
So, I guess so many questions. Who are some of your major influences as writers, as creators of, fictional or even tellers of nonfiction?
Well, I can and I will name some writers. Of course, the great tradition of Southern writers. Walker Percy asked why there were so many Southern writers, and he said because we lost the war, and that's really
it's a good answer.
The experience of loss. Look what it did for African American music. The experience. Look at what he did for Jewish culture. The experience of suffering it's people sing out their pain. But my first influences are, the guys sitting around the family, the bar at the tavern, telling stories, and and my father, who was a great storyteller and who just who really knew how to tell a story, and there were two ways that a man could claim power. One was through violence, and the other was by being able to tell a good story. And I wasn't going to go to the first place. And
why not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was gay. I was the youngest kid. I was from earliest consciousness.
You were number 9 of 9 siblings in your family.
And I don't know if you know this, but it is statistically demonstrable that the younger sons are more likely to be gay. Whenever I meet anybody who is the youngest son of the family, I say, oh yeah, must be gay. Good chance, There are theories about why this is the case. There's theories that the mother's womb produces a certain hormone to reduce competition for the older sons.
Right.
I think it is some great wisdom that's maybe shouldn't be put into words, that says we need some people whose job it is to shepherd culture and whose job it is to make the world beautiful. And we're going to figure out, and then we need other people. Hinduism would say this, you need warriors, you need priests, you need merchants, you need scholars, you need whatever, and you need farmers. Unfortunately, it puts them all in a hierarchy, but anyway, I knew that to stay alive, I had to get out, and I just maintained the lowest possible profile until I was 17.
And then you left somehow. Your father was working for Seagram's or something. You got a scholarship.
Yeah, my father was in charge of maintenance at what we would today call a craft bourbon distillery, a small bourbon distillery, made a bourbon called Antique, no longer made. And they had a scholarship for a son or a daughter of a Seagram's employee, and I got that scholarship, and I said, later.
How did you get that scholarship?
It had always been kind of legend in the family. My father wanted all of his, he wanted the daughters. I'm not even sure he allowed the daughters to apply, but it was my mother who, she said many years later to me, it was the first time I thought about divorcing your father was when he said he was not going to let the girls go to college. And I said, if the boys are going to go to college, the girls are going to go to college. My mother she was a really marvelous, she was a pretty amazing woman. Mm. My father was an amazing person, but he was a 19th century man. He was the oldest son of his family. He was raised by people whose system of values was firmly grounded in 1860.
Right.
And now looking back, I can see that it was a privilege to be able to have that much history in my life. It didn't feel that way when I was 16 years old, but anyway, I just did it all on my own. I just said, if I'm going to live, I got to get out of this place. So how am I going to do that?
And so did you have to write an essay or send samples of your writing and all that stuff?
So the way it happened was my sister had gone out to California, the first person to go to California. And she wrote me a letter and said, there's this really good junior college in Northern California that everybody talks about. She was in LA. And I thought, I want to go to a junior college. But I wrote to it because she had mentioned it. It was Stanford. And the full name of Stanford is Leland Stanford Junior University because it's named after Leland Stanford Jr. That's why she thought it. And Stanford had marketing down long before everybody else. And they sent me, I mean, everybody else was just sending letters. And I wrote to MIT and I wrote to, what did I know, And they sent this catalog, 80-page catalog filled with pictures of hunky guys in Speedos lounging under palm trees next to Lake Lagunitas. And I thought, wow, that's where I want to go to school.
And so in addition to, I'm guessing, being sort of titillating, did it make you think, here's a place where I can be more truly who I am?
I didn't know. I'd never met a gay person. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know that I was gay. I didn't know what that meant.
Oh, you didn't know at that point?
Well, I mean, I knew that I was attracted to men. It was a terrible thing, but I just thought I was common story of that time that is, among the things forgotten these days that I try to bring attention to whenever I speak is that the profound loneliness of being, 18 years old in rural Kentucky and thinking that I was literally the only person in the world who had ever suffered this kind of destiny. And also the fact that all these people today who take their careers, all these gay people who are, out, Rachel Maddow, whoever, their lives are built on the dead bodies of the people who died of AIDS in the 1980s.
Right.
Because that's, in the 1970s when I moved up to San Francisco, we would say things like, well, if only everybody who was gay turned purple overnight. Well, suddenly they did. Here's a so in W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, actually it's Souls of White Folk, he says, if you think that I'm exaggerating when I talk about the prejudice against Black people, look at yourself and think how many people would not rejoice at hearing the news that half of the African American population had died and the other half was dying. And I read that sentence and I thought, I lived through that because, in 1983, that's what they said about gay people.
Right.
Half of, he's Cardinal, what's his name,
Yes.
gets up in the pulpit and says, these people deserve their fates
In New York?
In New York.
Spellman?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I don't remember who was the archbishop then, but.
Right. Now we're talking about cardinals and archbishops. You grew up, I think you said, a mile as the crow flies from an abbey, the Abbey of Gethsemane.
Yeah, where Thomas Merton wrote, and
right.
I took that fact for granted. I didn't know that. I'd never been out of the world. I'd never taken a bus. I'd never used a pay telephone. I didn't know how to order from a menu. I mean, I none of this stuff until I got to California. My mother would give Merton a ride to the train station in Elizabethtown in that old red Ford Country Squire station wagon.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Were all 11 you ever in that Country Squire station wagon?
And I would sit in the back, and my mother, who had never gone to college, would have theological debates with Merton. Merton and my mother would talk back and forth about, these, theological issues. Anyway, that was all happening, and the monks would, famously sneak out of the monastery at night, come to my parents' house, drink beer, smoke cigarettes, watch football on television. And, so I grew up with, and they were educated people, they came from exotic places like New Jersey, Ohio.
Yeah, where Merton came from all over, right? France,
well, he
England.
was from France via the Bahamas. He actually was from an exotic place. And there were people, the guy who was Dom James, who was the abbot at that time, was an MBA from Harvard. But my father was a blue-collar guy, and he didn't like hanging out with the educated. He said they got their hands in the honey pot. And the people who came to the men who came to my parents' house were all the blue collar workers. They were the
Right.
plumber, the carpenter, the farmer, and they would sit around, and he would take whiskey over to the monastery, and they would go out to the cow barn and sit and drink whiskey and tell stories till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning.
Love that.
And
Do you remember your dad or both your folks being especially good storytellers?
yeah, yeah, my father. I mean, from my father, I learned pacing, which is absolutely essential. How to delay and control and parse out and information. I define pacing as the controlled revelation of information, and that I learned from my father.
Nice.
From my mother, I learned a kind of intellectual curiosity that was boundless, and also a sense that every creature, not just every human being, but every creature has its right to a place on the planet, and that has to be respected.
Right.
My mother felt that very strongly and acted it out.
So you interacted with these monks. Some of them came over your house,
Brother Fenton.
you? What's that?
Brother Fenton.
Yeah, Brother
That's
Fenton.
the source of my name.
Who you're named after. And were any of them gay?
Brother
I think they
Fenton
were.
was
And
gay.
were you aware of that? And did you feel any connection, even if you weren't quite sure of your own?
I felt connection to a community of men. And even deeper than that, I felt a connection to a community of people who had dedicated it in the ideal, a phrase that is underscored and bold-faced, in the ideal, had dedicated their lives to making the world beautiful. And that was really profoundly influential. I took for granted going over to this place where these people, these men, in this very macho Southern culture, in the middle of it, here were these men who were dedicated to peace and beauty.
Right.
It was I mean, you just absorb that sort of thing osmotically.
Right.
But, and it was the only world I knew. I loved going to the services at the monastery because they were so medieval. I mean, it was all this pomp and circumstance and Latin and
right.
processions and flowers.
And Merton talks about that as, he found his way to Catholicism.
Yeah.
Loving all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it also came accompanied with, one must not forget, sexual abuse. Even today, here's another, Jeopardy question. What is the largest institutional slave owner in the United States? Was the Catholic Church. And it has the current archivist, I know because I'm doing this research, for the Archdiocese of Louisville, he says, I'm not really interested in talking about that. I would say I think unprintable language, in response to that.
Oof.
So, I mean, there was this world of, and Catholics, I'm convinced that when Bill Clinton became president, he sat down with the Archbishop of Washington and said, okay, we got this problem with gays in the military. How do we deal with it? And the Archbishop said, oh, don't ask, don't tell. It's our
Been working for us for
been working
centuries.
for us for centuries.
That's funny. So you left this world that sounded kind of wonderful in terms of the ideas that was put in your head, and you went to California, and that just sounds like an enormous amount of culture shock. How was that for you?
I haven't recovered. I'll never recover. In a
good way and a bad way, or
in a way.
In a way.
I had to get out. I had to go somewhere. And, my wise and beloved mother said many years later, I was glad for you that you got out. I was glad for you that you left. Is that true now? I don't know. Doesn't it seem like we're in one of those periods where we're going backwards instead of going forwards? That it's
right.
It's it's the United States after 1876, and And despite, and we say now, looking back at those years, how could that have happened? And we see right now that these legislatures and politicians are acting out legislation in open defiance of the wishes of their electorate.
Right.
And yet the laws are being put on the books, and they will take a long time.
It's insane. It just
It is.
boils me up.
I know. Let's all go to France, except that things aren't so great in France. But anyway.
The unions are strong.
Yes.
So that's nice.
And the French, that's my other country. My other country is France.
And how so?
Well, my partner, who was the only child of Holocaust survivors, died of AIDS in Paris in 1990. And he was determined. I had taken French courses in college, and the French Catholics were the first Catholics in Kentucky. So there was a French thing going on there, but he just said, oh, he was a first generation. His parents were Holocaust survivors, so he was more European than he was American. He said, of course you're going to learn French, and of course we are going to spend a lot of time in France. I thought, you're out of your mind. I learned French. We spent a lot of time in France.
How sweet.
Died in Paris.
And what was his name?
Larry Rose.
Larry Rose.
And, his death under very dramatic circumstances kind of, put the brand of Marianne in my flesh in a way that was not at all happy or pleasant. But yet I've gone back there again and again and again and again and again. I don't really go much of other places internationally, but I go back to France a lot.
Right. So the brand of Marianne or the brand of France must not be entirely unpleasant if you
No, like France.
All right,
La belle France.
Is that all just self-flagellation, like visiting?
Well, it's, as I said in one of my books, a sentence that's smarter than I was then and now.
I love that. One of your books is smarter than you are.
They're all smarter than I am.
Well, Chef.
Grief is like any wound. There is some terrible pleasure in it. And, and going back to, now I have my own life. I went back to France partly to prove that I could do so, without him, and I went there ironically to liberate myself from the memory of that last trip to France. And what ended up happening was that I got pulled deeper in, and as you say, and as I agree, what's not to like? It's France,
That's nice. So how often do you get back there?
Well, I was there for 6 months before I came here in Paris. I had lived all over France, but never, and I'd been through Paris many times, but I'd never lived in Paris. I felt like to say that one knows France, one really had to live in Paris. And then, of course, the United States and France have in some ways, despite the language barrier, a intimate relationship that is in some ways deeper than the relationship with England.
England, yeah.
And the reason why that's the case is because the French had a famously violent revolution, and there was an NYU historian at Rhinecliff who said, "Oh, we Americans should be proud because our revolution was relatively bloodless compared to France, for example." Well, that's because our revolution came in 1860 through 1865. And 600,000, 700,000 people were killed. It was not a bloodless revolution at all. The revolution of 1776 was just about old white guys, many of them slave owners, not wanting to pay their taxes. The revolution of 1861 was really about, this sentence has been written, all men are created equal. Are you going to live up to it or are you not? And that was the revolution. And it's still going on.
Amazing. I'm going to take a second here to give you a proper introduction instead of introducing the other Fenton Johnson here or not. And I read this from your website. It's just lovely. Fenton Johnson is Emeritus Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Arizona and serves on the faculty of Spalding University's Low Residency MFA program. and this is the part I love, among his achievements, he counts playing a role in one of the 20th century's great human rights struggles, creating a classroom many times over where students transformed knowledge into wisdom, the ever-spreading influence of those students, creating a space for the voiceless to be heard, creating a home for plants and wild creatures, and being a good host and a good friend.
I wrote that?
Yeah.
That's so good.
It's better than you are.
Yeah, it's something to aspire to, but that's what you do.
Lovely.
You said you raise the bar. And I mean, that's the terrible and scary thing about publishing. For me, I publish something and then I got to live up to it. It's scary.
How often do you do that? It sounds like you don't think you really do live up to that it's slightly better.
Well, I don't know. It's for other people to make that judgment, not me. Long after I'm dead,
Yeah.
Nobody will remember me anyway. That's the good news.
Right. Here's another quote from, I think this is from your website as well. I believe that each of us is called to a lifelong wrestling match with God, and that God always wins, but that our task is to put up a good fight.
Yeah. And there's a passive voice there. There's something that I think everybody is called to a destiny. Hinduism would argue that. And the challenge, and the Tao Te Ching would say that our task is to try to find the wavelength, whatever the wavelength is, and to work and write or be in consonance with it instead of in opposition to it. And sometimes the wavelength is about retreat and seclusion and silence. And sometimes the wavelength is about activism and argument and demonstration. And sometimes the wavelength, I'm a pacifist. The reason I went to California was not, I think it was because I knew that I was gay. There
Right.
were all those guys in Speedos next to the Lake Lagunita in the pictures. But the real reason was the Vietnam War was on, and provides an opportunity to remember the people who died at Kent State and at Jackson State
Right.
today, however many years ago. But I was looking for a way to stay out of Vietnam. And I
Sure.
thought if I got near San Francisco, somebody there would help me.
And
That
did
proved-
they?
No.
No.
They told me because I was at Stanford. I was at Stanford. And
Stanford Junior College.
and they'd never had anybody like me. And they said, the Santa Clara County Draft Board is turning away a lot of people. You should apply wherever your home is. So I took their advice and I applied in Nelson County, Kentucky. And, ultimately
Applied, you mean registered?
as a conscientious objector.
Oh, okay.
And went through the whole process, had a hearing. All of my friends' fathers, what the hell is the son of P.D. Johnson doing here? And I got the only conscientious objectorship given in the history of the Nelson County Draft Board.
Amazing. So let me ask this. You were in California. You said you'd not sort of come out to yourself as gay. When did that happen? And part two of this question is, when did you tell your parents? And part three is, did your mom say, "Oh yeah, honey, we always knew that," or was she surprised?
My father had died. That's not an accident.
I
He
see.
had died. It was in a way, I don't know what would have happened if I'd had to tell him, but he was dead by this point.
So there was
It was
a
the
little
middle
liberation.
1980s. My mother was a smart person, as we have established, and she knew what AIDS was. But there were people dying. There were men dying in rural Kentucky. So I took her out and told her, and because I was publishing a story that had gay character, and I knew that she would put two and two together. So I told her that moment, of course, is in my head right now. And she said, "Well," I kind of suspicioned as much. She was reduced to her childhood grammar, by the moment. But then she said, "You have to be yourself. You have to lead your life. It is your life. It is not anybody else's life." So,
Kind of lovely.
yeah.
So you just said, you quoted her, kind of suspicioned as much. And this is the thing it's actually, I just read an article becoming very much in vogue. Verbizing, nouns and adjectives.
Sure.
Do you write in her voice often, or the voice of the folks who surrounded you in the South? I mean, Faulkner's famous for doing that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think again somebody else would have to make that decision. I mean,
But you must be aware if you write the sentence, I kind of suspicion to that.
Well, in writing the last novel that I published called The Man Who Loved Birds, there is a character who is a renegade sexual outlaw marijuana grower, illiterate, and I had to make a decision about whether to write in dialect and risk that awful. It has been said that after Huckleberry Finn, nobody can write dialect. That's not true, but there's a certain truth in it. And I feel like I did a pretty good job of recreating his voice. But all of the characters are me in some way or another.
Interesting.
I mean, I grew up with those voices. I grew up with people speaking in very rich ways. But there are, who's this person? Kitsy, somebody who has a restaurant in Albany, who's a black man who was on the food program today on the Albany public radio station.
Oh, I don't know.
And I heard like 3 words. I almost always turn them off. I heard this person speak a sentence and I said, I got to listen to this. Because he had this amazing combination of a sort of Bronx accent with a deep South black inflection,
right,
and some upstate New York. It was very, I have to say
funny.
The one thing I miss here is the softness of the accent that I grew up with. And many of those accents that come out of the New York metropolitan area, even as I love hearing them, they hurt my ear.
Right.
And I like the kind of broad. On the other hand, accents are growing stronger,
It's good they're not getting lost.
I think so, but it's also a manifestation of the fact that when we were growing up, there were 3 television stations and they told us how to speak.
Right.
Now there are 75,000.
And also people wanted to assimilate. They wanted to speak that way.
Yes.
And now
cultural aspiration.
Now that's not so much a cultural aspiration anymore.
That's correct.
So when you're writing in dialect, do you ever wonder if you're running afoul of political correctness? Like, because I assume you're writing white characters, black characters, and everybody, you're writing in the dialect that you hear them in your head.
I always felt organically drawn to writing from the point of view of women, and I feel that I have done it well.
Interesting. So you were in France for 6 months and then found your way to Rhinebeck.
Yeah, I mean, I'm here to tell you the housing crisis is real, and the reason I found my way to Rhinebeck is that it was the only place that I managed to land an apartment. But in fact, I feel like it's turned out really well because I was a little uneasy about how I would adjust to living in. I haven't lived in a town this small. Rhinebeck is much bigger than the town that I grew up in, but still, I haven't lived in a town this small since I left New Haven, Kentucky, when I was 17. So I was a little uneasy about that, and I think it's worked out really well. And one of the reasons is that I have good fortune to rent the house next to yours, and you've been a great friend and neighbor and host, and introduced me to wonderful people, and then I've realized that if I get a traffic ticket for doing 75 in a 25 zone, that if I just say, well, Norm Magnusson is a really good friend of mine.
Let me know if that works, because I would love to try that.
So anyway, it's worked out well, and we'll see how that continues. But yeah.
Huh. And you're going to be looking for a new place?
I am looking
at
for
some
a new
point.
place. I have to say that I miss. You ask about the world that I grew up in. There were still black people, and I'm enormously grateful for that now. but we were very much at the tail end of the process of driving the black people out. Of course, it was not done, I don't know why I should say of course, but by that point, it was not done overtly with lynching or whatever. But these people had been made to understand that in infinite numbers of ways that they were not welcome.
Right.
And I feel that the same thing happened, that there was a kind of cleansing of LGBT people from small town areas because, once an opportunity, you realize you could go to Castro Street or you could go to Chelsea or the Village or wherever, people left in droves. When I was growing up, there were people like, Miss Erman, the librarian, and John Morgan Markham, the Baptist church organist. And, there are all these people that were, that everybody knew were sort of odd,
That's
and
funny.
there was it wasn't openly talked about. I was told that I should not hang out with John Morgan Markham.
John Morgan who?
Markham, because I now realize, even my mother told me that, and I now realize it was because she knew that he was gay. They also told me I wanted to take piano lessons.
From
Sisters that had
Liberace.
Piano lesson. The only male piano player that my father had ever known or seen was Liberace, and he
Right.
said, I got the message conveyed back to me through my mother that I could take drum lessons, but I could not take piano.
Like after Buddy Rich,
And it was
here's a
because,
good role model.
They had their suspicions, and they thought that piano lessons
Would
were
turn you.
only going to turn me into Liberace. Should I have been so lucky?
And so did you take drum lessons?
No, I very sensibly said, I don't want to play the drum. I want to play the piano.
Right.
So I never took any lessons, any musical training.
And now you sing,
I
right?
sang. I play the banjo a little bit, but just for fun.
Just to keep the Kentucky citizenship.
Yeah. Sing along with it.
And who do you sing with?
I was singing with the Capella Festival, which is the Vassar chorus. And they're more sophisticated and more challenging, which I like. But this semester, I had a lot of things going on, so I migrated over to the Bard Community Chorus, which is also good, really great director. But the music is not quite as challenging as the Vassar music. And I don't know. I mean, I have a sense of rhythm and pacing, and I can carry a tune. I wish I had a stunning voice. I wish. I have a pleasant voice. I have a good voice. I'm a good person for a chorus.
Right.
Because I blend well with other people. But I to be a soloist, maybe after another Manhattan.
Oh, good. Well, pour one up. We'll get some solo stuff going on here on the radio. I want to ask about growing up one of 9. That's a pretty large number. Are you
In my hometown, it was an entirely average family. The neighbors across the street had 17 children. They had a big family. But, 8 was getting up there, but 6 to 8 was kind of an average size family.
And what was the age spread between you were the youngest? How much older was the oldest?
My oldest sister is almost 16 years older than I.
Right.
So I was born in 53. She was born in 38, I think. Something like that. 52 and
And so how many of them are still with us?
3 are gone, and there are 6 of us left, including me.
And how many of them do you keep in contact with? Do you want to call when you have good news?
I don't. We don't. We aren't close in a way that we don't know how to be a family. For one thing, we all got exploded into we all had to leave to make a living.
Right.
Because of the great rural migration.
Right.
But there's also
You said one of your sisters, anyways, down there.
yeah,
And she's
all of my family still lives in
and
Kentucky.
she's the archivist for all the papers.
She's the one who is the most conventionally, I suppose I would say, civilized. I have a brother who's a trapper, a brother who
I read
is,
a chapter in one of your books.
yeah.
It featured
Well,
him.
I learned all that information, which is entirely factual, about trapping comes from him. I mean, it happened because he took me out. He said, "You want to go trapping?" And, the thing about being a writer, you always say yes.
Let me ask a hypothetical question, because I don't think you're allowed to trap around here. If one were to trap a skunk and get it in the trap, how would one avoid being sprayed by that skunk when you go to collect the trap and move it elsewhere?
Well, one, I know from my brother that the way my brother said that they're really very placid animals because they don't really have any enemies other than great horned owls, whom I've heard quite a few of in our neighborhood recently. So he said, talk to them, sing to them, and they like being sung to. So I sang to
Love this. Your brother, the trapper, has this advice for somebody who's hypothetically catching.
He's trapped a lot of. Hey, my brother's. There's a piece to be written. I wanted to write it. I mean, a nonfiction piece about trapping, but I couldn't figure out any way to write it that I wouldn't beg the issue of political correctness around wearing furs. And I just didn't want to get into that,
Right.
I just wanted to say, these are people, they're doing this thing, this is how they do it. But, there's a period still there where you couldn't say that. But to talk about, trapping small furry creatures was to get into trouble.
Right.
And I have enough trouble, so I didn't write it.
Yeah, lots of people might not like that, but with skunks, I mean, people would want the skunk.
Actually, my brother tells me that the only fur that is selling internationally right now is skunk fur. And he has a whole recipe, which I'm happy to provide for anybody who wants, about how to get the smell out of skunk fur. And the skunk that I trapped was
hypothetically speaking, had you trapped a skunk.
No, but it was beautiful. It was,
they're gorgeous.
Yeah. Well, this skunk, which lived in your neighborhood, was so fat from open compost heaps that it waddled when it walked. I mean, it was like a yard wide, and it was cream colored with a black stripe down its back.
Right.
Very handsome.
So let's just say, for the sake of continuing this hypothetical illustration, that you had trapped a skunk and were moved. What would you have sung to it?
Well, I sang Elvis tunes because that's just happened to be in my head that morning.
Which Elvis tune?
Take my hand, take my whole life, because I can't help falling in love with you. Anyway, it got me there. I did not get, the professional pest person said, you can't do that without getting sprayed. I did not get sprayed.
I love that so much. All right, this is a perfect place to end. I hope you'll come back, because I really want to talk about your most recent book and about solitude and all of that stuff. But that's a great place to end. And
next time, mint juleps.
Next time, mint juleps. Thanks for bringing the mint. It's been so nice having you here, and thank you for being such a happy guest and for bringing the perfect Manhattans. Happy Friday, everyone. Though it won't be Friday, I guess, by the time you listen to this online. Happy whatever day is. Thanks for tuning in, and have a great time.